Hello, everyone. Welcome to Go for Launch. Today, Mackenzie and I are joined by Dr. Shane Hanlon, who is the executive editor of C&EN Brand Lab. Welcome, Shane.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're going to go ahead and get right into it. We know that you're a conservation biologist turned science communicator. So, can you tell our audience a little bit about your background in STEM and what it is that you do now?
Yeah, certainly. Like you mentioned, I have a PhD in biology, and I originally got into biology because I knew I wanted to be a scientist in some capacity. I was always really interested in science, and I got into ecology and conservation basically because as an undergrad, I wanted to do something in the field. I wanted to be outside. And where I went to undergrad, the only person who was doing any sort of ecology related work with animals that wasn't plant work was doing things with amphibians and reptiles. And I had liked frogs and turtles and snakes and things growing up. I never really thought I'd make a career out of it, but I figured, you know what? Sure, let's do this. And I loved it. And I learned a lot about the amphibian decline crisis and conservation. And so I wanted to pull that through into my PhD. And so I did toxicology work and disease ecology work. And I really loved, like, conservation is still a big passion of mine. But somewhere in the process of getting my PhD, I was in just a kind of basic biology department. And I started to get this like little, I don't know, this feeling about what happens to science outside of academia, outside of the ivory tower, specifically applied science, the type of stuff I was doing. And I I wanted to investigate that. And so I started looking at options for kind of non-academic post-PhD things. And I came across a basically a policy postdoc that's run through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's called the Sea Grant Canals Fellowship. So basically, they take newly minted PhDs or master students and they plop them into executive branch offices in the federal government or legislative offices with senators, representatives. And I ended up at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in their Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs. And so basically, I went from being a muddy boots ecologist to a suit on Capitol Hill. Um, and I really liked that experience. I really valued it. I learned a ton. I was meeting with senators, representatives, and working for a branch of the federal government that I really believed in, and being able to see kind of the capital C policy or capital P policy process. But I realized that I was interested in policy, but being in policy for as a career wasn't quite my jam. But what I did learn, and I learned a little bit of this when I was a grad student as well, is I liked talking to people. I liked talking about what what I did as a scientist. I like talking to folks and helping them to understand it. And so I didn't really know about science communication as a career. I kind of just stumbled into it based on this work with policy. And so I went from U.S. Fish and Wildlife to I worked at the National Academies for a while. They had a museum at the time, and I liked doing the public outreach aspect. And I ended up at the American Geophysical Union, which is how I met you, Audrey, and in their sharing science program, which ostensibly we were. My former colleague is still there. Scientists who help other scientists talk to non-scientists. So training folks on science communication, getting into education. I ended up co-founding and running our podcast there. I did a lot of those things, and so I became like a full-fledged science communicator. Left some of that conservation stuff in the past, moving more into this world of science communication, and then about I can't say recently anymore. A little over a year ago, I transitioned to my current role where I work for the American Chemical Society and I am executive editor of C&EN Brand Lab. And we are a custom content studio. And so what that means is I'm in science marketing now. Like I am technically in a marketing and sales department at ACS. And instead of teaching fellow scientists how to communicate, we create science communication materials for them. So we have an external arm where clients literally come to us and they will hire us to help them do that. I manage a team of editors and writers and freelancers. And then also we do a lot of internal work within the society and things like helping to create content around mentoring and DEIR and trust in science. And so it's all been in the science communication world, just kind of shifting the frame from teaching the folks how to do it, doing it kind of directly, and then managing a team and a unit of folks who do it for a number of different types of clients and partners and collaborators.
Wow, that all sounds super interesting. And you keep mentioning science communication and the scientists specifically. Can you explain what science communication and humanizing scientists mean to you and why other scientists should care about those kinds of things as well?
It's this is hokey, but it's why I do what I do. It's why I care about being in science communication. In addition to the kind of ACS and the mainstream job work that I do, I also work with an organization called the Story Collider, where folks get on stage and tell true personal stories about science. It's kind of similar to the Moth, if folks are familiar with that, except with a science bend. And all of that work and a lot of the work that I do now is about showing that scientists aren't just the stereotypes. They're not just folks, predominantly men, predominantly white men in the lab wearing lab coat in front of a micro or behind a microscope, being inaccessible, being uninteresting, being inefficient communicators. Like some of that stuff exists, sure, but by no means is that the typical scientist. We are all sorts of different folks. We contain multitudes. Scientists are just like everyone else, except they happen to do a really cool, a really interesting job, in my personal opinion. And so there's a lot to be said about showing just that people, no matter who they are and what career they're in, they're just kind of people. Um, because science, especially some aspects of science that I've been working in or at least adjacent to, can be really polarizing. There are issues around trust in science and scientists, and I really believe in the work that's showing that if you show that you're just kind of a person, that you're just like a neighbor or a friend or a family member, that folks will relate to you more. They'll trust you more. They will understand and care about the work that you do. And so not every single aspect of science communication is that, but a lot of it is. And I really try to weave that into, if not everything that I do, a lot of the different things that I'm able to work on.
That's super cool. And it sounds like you've had a lot of different opportunities to pursue science communication through a lot of different outlets and at various stages of your career. So I'm wondering if you did much science communication work as a PhD student, and if so, whether you have some advice on balancing academics and that science communication work, and maybe particularly if you have any advice for students who might be working with advisors who push them more toward the research side, advisors who don't necessarily see the value in science communication.
I did do some work as a researcher. That's actually how I originally got interested in communication. I had a friend who was a what grade did she teach? 7th, 8th grade science teacher when I was in grad school. And so I would go speak with her class pretty often actually about science. I studied amphibians and reptiles. We literally had frogs and salamanders and different things in the lab that I could literally take to them. So that was really fun and really engaging. And that was just more of a folks are interested in this. I like talking about it. This is fun. I would talk to different kind of like clubs or interest groups. We had a botanical garden really close to the university where I was at, and they had kind of regular series. And so I would go and talk to mostly volunteers, retirees, but folks who were really interested. And then I started, this was, I don't know, a bit ago, but like blogging was really, I guess we come full circles on blogs, but blogging was really a thing when I was in grad school. And so a handful of friends and I started kind of like a popular science blog. And this was mostly just because I found it interesting. And I really enjoyed being a researcher. I didn't talk about this maybe a little bit, but I didn't leave academia because I didn't like it. It's just the opportunity afforded itself. But I never liked writing like a researcher, and I never liked talking again, we're gonna stereotype, but I never liked that stereotype of this is the way you talk, this is the way you write. And so I mainly just did it for me. I just liked sharing the science in a way that I could see other folks who weren't my peers, who weren't even obligated to care about this, really connecting with it. And so that's really like what created, I guess, this spark. And I will say I was fortunate enough from a mentor, at least my direct advisor, to have an advisor who I wouldn't say was effusive in his praise or support about it, but on the flip side, didn't hold me back. Basically, it was, if you want to do this and you can continue to do your research, teach, like check all of the boxes that are part of the on paper version of receiving this PhD, go forth and do. I will say I understand that's not the case for everyone, if not most folks, frankly. And so I did have some colleagues, some friends at the time who didn't have advisors or folks in their dissertation committee, whoever, who were as supportive. And one thing I saw that worked for them was that they would find those folks who were, whether that would be a formal kind of member of their dissertation committee, pulling someone on who was really interested in outreach and really saw the value of science communication because it's incredibly valuable. Of course it is. Or maybe even just finding like informal mentors or creating their kind of own network. That doesn't, that's not necessarily an answer if you have an advisor who is just emphatically no. I mean, it's the situation is going to be different for everyone. But it was helpful for me having a passive mentor, but I know really helpful for some of my friends and colleagues who were able to go out and kind of find their own support system or find folks or find, if not formal, like informal advisors who are able to provide that support, who would understand where they're coming from, and also maybe just be able to navigate some of the potential like departmental politics of that. So the situation will be different for everyone. It'll be unique to every person, but it requires a little bit more effort. But I've seen success in folks going out there and kind of finding their own support system.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It sounds like mentoring and building a network is really important to sort of your experience and what it sounds like might be like lots of science communicators' experiences. We've talked a bit about networking on this show, so it's really great to hear that echoed in your advice to students who might
Mhm.
be wanting to pursue those paths.
Absolutely. I mean, they say it's all about who you know these days, and it's so unbelievably true. It's crazy. But we've talked a lot about the whole PhD thing. As somebody who does not have one yet and still, considers, is it worth it? Should I do it? I do like research. I've had the experience. But I also have really fallen in love with just the informal science education kind of thing. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting out in, getting out of their undergrad or at least even maybe still in school that wants to break out into these kinds of fields where they maybe don't have anybody to lean on just yet? I know it took me a few years in undergraduate to find a support, and as that grows throughout academia, that's great and dandy. But for somebody that doesn't have any of it yet, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of the beauty of our connected society, especially digitally connected society these days. I know that my short answer to this used to be Twitter. That is not my answer now for a number of reasons. But I do think there is still value in uh, community or maybe like other social media platforms or just going out there and seeing what folks are doing and connecting directly with folks in the digital space if that kind of in person or department or whatever like that community structure isn't there. This is unfortunately science communication is always almost always an and it shouldn't be. And I I think the culture is changing. I think it is shifting, but there still isn't kind of formal structures in place for many folks. But there are so many people out there who love doing it. There are organizations like there's annual conferences like the Sci Talk conference, where is a great community of folks interested in communicating science. There are resources through scientific societies. Like I know ACS, we have some AGU, where I was formerly, like I mentioned, it's how I know Audrey through things like the Voices for Science program or different things like that. I know AAAS has resources. So it's a matter of I'm not gonna say it's easy, but on the flip side, it's just like I feel like it's one of those things, like when going out for careers, when you start looking and start figuring out what are those even just like search keywords, who is doing interesting things that you can just maybe connect with directly, uh, what types of communication are you interested in, and does it require a support system or just infrastructure to get started? Or is it something like, I want to start a Substack? That doesn't really require much from anyone else. I don't, will anyone read it? Who knows? But it's gratifying to like you as an individual. So those are kind of the some like suggestions for the I'm not gonna say organic, but like things where a formal system or structure and doesn't need to be in place. I also just want to say too, like I have a PhD, and I'm now a professional science communicator, and my PhD has nothing to do with what I do for a living, and it might never have anything to do with what I do for a living. I hope that's not the case, but it is right now, and I'm a-okay with that. Um, I'm really happy I got my PhD. I really enjoyed research, and I'm very passionate about what I studied, and I still kind of keep a foot in that world. But I don't need those letters after my name to do what I do, and a vast majority of careers and jobs in the science communication, even science policy space, do not require advanced degrees in this very, like, niche little area of science to do that type of work, and so if there are folks out there who are thinking about, "Do I need to go get a PhD in an area of science to then maybe go on and be a general, put that in quotes, science communicator?" The answer is probably no. Would it potentially help folks? Maybe, but also it's a matter of like how much time do you want to invest, how interested you in a subject. So I will never, I never will like say that folks need to get a PhD to do most of the things in science communication. On the flip side, though, I've talked to a lot of folks, and I was one of these people who I'm super happy I did it. And maybe that's something like maybe it does make more sense to go down kind of the quote unquote traditional path of becoming a researcher and then make that shift later. That's what I love about this world of science communication is that no one has, almost literally, no one has the same path. And I think instead of that being daunting, like, "Oh, I don't have, like, one person to look like," the opposite is true. There's so many different options out there. The one option I took is just one of hundreds, if not thousands, and so I think that's a kind of a blessing and not a curse.
Absolutely. That's pretty pretty cool. I remember myself kind of finding the area of science communication, or at least like education research. How do people learn this
Mhm.
kind of stuff? And never being able, I was like, I want to do this very specific thing and make sure that people can learn it efficiently and stuff. And kind of went up to my advisor and said, this is what I want to do. How do I do it? He's like, well, this is actually already a field and you have no idea about it. And the person in charge of that field is like down the hall. So
Oh,
I was like, oh my
that's
gosh,
amazing.
that's crazy, you know? Um, but it comes back again to that whole, who do you know, and are you willing to kind of bet on yourself? Just make your own path, because somebody along the way is going to be there to help you do it. But you
Yeah.
mentioned your PhD, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about that. What inspired you ultimately to pursue your PhD in biology? And was there kind of a moment in there that kind of stands out as the switch from biology to science communication?
Yeah, so I have 2 literally, like, 2 moments where I'm not a h I wouldn't say my life is punctuated by aha moments, but these kind of were ones. I got into biology, I was interested in biology, like, that was just always how I was growing up, everything like that. So I knew I wanted to go to school for that. I originally thought I wanted to be a high school teacher. Because I've always enjoyed the education aspect of things, and I went to University of Pittsburgh for my undergraduate. I'm from Pennsylvania, I love Pitt, that was always kind of in the cards, and I liked them specifically because they had a program where you could get a bachelor's and a degree and then stick on for another full year and get a master's in teaching. And so you wouldn't go to school to be an educator. You would go to school to earn a degree and then get the education on top of it to be that teacher. And so I kind of like that dynamic. And so maybe that I always had something in the back of my mind that I wanted to do a little bit something different. And I remember about halfway through undergrad, I was working with a grad student doing kind of the typical, I'm a lab assistant, whatever it is. And we're out in the field doing plant work, and I absolutely hated that aspect of it. But I remember looking at, I make this joke, I remember like looking at this grad student, this guy I was working with, and he was like overworked and underpaid and just always tired and like scraping bit to bit. And like, I don't even say this facetiously. I wanted that life. Like, he was so fulfilled and so happy and just believed so deeply in what he was doing. And up until that point, I'm a 20-year-old who haven't really thought about much of anything. And I literally like there was a spark there for him. And so I started thinking like, oh, maybe it's grad school. And the more I dug into it and the more I talked to folks and everything, that's really when it shifted, was those undergraduate research experiences and seeing literally who these scientists were, back to this humanization point, like what they cared about, what they're passionate about. And they're just normal folks, but just care so deeply about what they do, and I wanted that. And so that's what really drove me to the PhD aspect of things. The flip side of that, what kind of pulled me out of that, and I will say it took me a long time to, I won't say come to terms, but to not keep doing the grass is greener thing. When I left research and went more into science communication, for years, I would wonder, did I make the right decision? Can I go back to academia? Can I be a researcher again? And I would say as recently I've been out of I got my PhD like around like 10 years ago at this point. And I would say as recently as a few years ago, I was still waffling back and forth. And I'm okay with that. Um, but the thing that really, I guess, crystallized for me or really settled it for me is that I personally uh, really enjoy helping others get their message out there. Because I realized pretty early that I was pretty good at it, just organically. I've always been a decent communicator. I myself can do this. This is not a thing that is universally like people are good at, though, independent of science is. Like, science has nothing to do with it. And again, not, I don't want to be hokey about it, but I wanted to help people to be able to do that for them to be able to say, like, I can go out there and either communicate my message or my message is getting out there. But also, I'm still a researcher, so I really dig into, we're talking kind of like the social science side of things. I'm really into the science behind science communication now. And I I know the benefits of being a good communicator. I know the benefits of being able to get science out there and how society reacts to that and how that has much broader implications than for just me personally. And so that's kind of like my mission, I guess my scientific mission, as it were, shifted, at least for now, from the conservation, I'm trying to help thing X, Y, or Z because it's the right thing to do and I'm a conservationist, which I am, but not in my research, to the I'm really focused on helping others communicate to get that message out there to shift the perception of science, to get more folks to accept science, to get more folks into science and scientists. So, two like those are kind of two areas where I do remember those moments where I'm like, oh, this is when it's happened. This is what I believe in. But I really like what I do now, and I plan on continuing this work for a while. But that's not to say that maybe I'll make a shift again. Who like I'm open to that as well, which I think is really exciting.
One thing I really liked that you just mentioned was that you noticed in yourself that you were good at communicating, that you did have this strength. I think personally, that's sort of an underrated like method of figuring out what it is that you want to do is almost just sort of like what Mackenzie said, betting on yourself and finding that strength in yourself and not so much like someone told you were good at it or you got an award in it or you were better at it than something else. So I really appreciate that bit of advice and hopefully that's helpful for some of our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just like communication, but it's like folks ask me, this might seem tangential, but I think it's related, like about how do you apply the skills that we learn as scientists, as researchers, kind of beyond the traditional research path. And it turns out that like as scientists, as researchers in particular, We are expected to do so many things that are just taken for granted in our day-to-day lives, whether it is communication or writing or creativity or management if you have doing projects with undergrad, or teamwork or collaboration or all these different things. And I think it's just a matter of it's just hard in the moment, especially when we're expected to do 1,000 different things, but just stepping back for a moment and doing kind of that self-assessment, like, okay, what are my strengths? What are things I can improve on? Do I want to push? Do I want to settle? Like whatever it is. And it took me a very long time to do that. But that's the something I'm really happy I was able to do is just kind of step back and think about not only what am I good at? Like I'm good. Like I'm not saying I'm the best or anything, but also what do I enjoy and where that kind of Venn diagram overlapped. Again, at least for now, it could change. But I do feel really lucky that I had the opportunity to do that and that it's just kind of worked out in a way it has so far.
Yeah, that's a really valuable bit of advice and sounds like a really valuable step in preparing yourself for your next career move, maybe whatever stage you're at. Something that I wanted to talk more about that we touched on a little bit throughout this episode is this trust in science concept that you mentioned. So it sounds like that's been pretty big for you in the work you've done more recently, but maybe throughout your career. Is that something you could tell us a little bit more about and maybe some what you find interesting about that or some of the findings in that area?
Yeah, I mentioned before I'm really into the social science behind communication now, which is probably not possibly not ironic. But I think folks misuse that word. But when I was a researcher, I kind of scoffed at social science. I was like, it's hard science or nothing. And I was very wrong. And I'm more than happy to admit that. Uh, but I've I think a lot of folks have realized that I realized, especially in my work, that if people do not trust science and scientists, they will not they will not believe them, obviously, but they will not connect with them. They will actively go against them. They will do thing X, Y, or Z that is in the polar opposite direction of what science is telling us and what scientists are advising. Part of that, of course, is on the audience. And that's like, there's some things to be done about that, but not much, frankly. People are people. That's the way it is. But there are things in which we as researchers, as scientists, as communicators can do to help get our messages across in the ways that folks will not only understand, understanding is a key component of science communication, but it's not the only one. There are whole theories and things about like the deficit model and this idea that if you just provide people information, they have a deficit of information. They just need to learn and they're going to learn it and they're going to accept it. That's not true. That's been thrown out. Um, so it's not just about understanding, but it's about resonating. It's about relating. It's about, is the message attractive? Do you care about this? And all of this, or at least most of this, is centered around trust. Do you trust the audience at hand or the person who is talking to an audience? And there are entire careers in institutes and things about trust in science, but what it always kind of boils down to, at least in my perception, it's about that humanization aspect. We as scientists are people. We're just people. And I think that it's much easier said than done, but just doing the day-to-day activities of talking to, neighbors or families or friends or whatever it is, and not even necessarily about science, but just, like, showing that scientists have outside interests, um, like, outdoorsy, or we like books, or we have hobbies, or, like, if you could see, I'm a musician, right? And that science is one aspect of who we are. It might be a big aspect, it might be the biggest aspect, but so much of what I've experienced personally and a lot of the research around trust in science is about the more you humanize, the more you frankly personalize, you show that people are just people, the more likely folks are to trust you as a scientist, and then also the message that is coming from you as a scientist. And this scales from really large issues like big political issues or things like I know climate change is obviously a huge one. I worked at that was a big thing when working at AGU. But it goes through every aspect of how we communicate science from things we think are really impactful and have literally worldwide implications to even just day-to-day messages of things that might seem more benign, but also like trust goes through all of it. So I think we should all care about trust, but I care about it professionally for a number of reasons. But I just kind of seen it in my day-to-day work as well, that if we just act like people to one another, and then, oh, by the way, I'm a scientist, it's like that kind of framing. It's not going to be the end all be all. It's not a cure all by any means, but it definitely, I think, does help.
Absolutely. And just to kind of, practice what we preach a little bit. You already mentioned that you do a little bit of music and stuff, but in an effort to humanize you, Shane, what is one thing about you that is like the complete opposite of the idea of being a scientist? Like I knew a scientist, and her answer to this, she's an astronomer. Her job is literally to like look in the direction, find new stuff. She gets lost everywhere. She cannot find her directions around. She has absolutely no clue where she is, and she's gotten used to it. She's like, "Oh, I'm lost again. I'll enjoy it." But just what is something kind of along that line that's the opposite of your science but still totally you?
Yeah, I have a lot of hobbies and I have a very broad interest. And actually, that might be the real answer to like why I'm not a researcher anymore. Is I really liked what I did, but I liked everything. One thing I will say, so I'm a huge movie buff. I see my partner and I probably see like an average of a movie every like week and a half. Like we go to movies.
Like
And I like
actually in the theater?
in the theater, yes. No, we have like a movie pass. We
Whoa.
do. It's a thing we do. And by that in of itself, like people like movies, great. Um, I like quote unquote good movies. I'm very interested in the Oscar race, all of that. I love bad sci-fi, like the worst sci-fi out there. We're talking about like Day After Tomorrow, Instant Freeze. This could literally never happen. The science is bad. The acting is mediocre. I relish that. And I have friends who are scientists who just can't. They can't separate it out. And I do not hold that against them. I can. I love really bad sci-fi where the science is so inaccurate and people get so mad about it. I'm able to just kind of completely like flip a switch and I turn it off. And I almost like it more because it's terrible. So I don't think that's good science communication. I just think that's entertainment. And I could be in the minority there and I could be completely wrong, but it's something I've never gotten I not only don't mind that it's bad, I actually really enjoy it. Like I have a really great time watching it.
That's so funny. I'm very much the person that you mentioned otherwise that's like, I cannot watch this. The science is insane.
Yeah.
I
And I understand that
but
and I appreciate that. But yeah, for me, I just for some reason I can
yeah.
make that disconnect and um maybe that's not the way to go, but it works for me.
Hey, we just learned a little bit about what makes you human. We like it.
Yes, let's humanize Shane.
Appreciate that.
Humanize scientists. One more question I have for you is whether or what do you think are the sort of biggest innovations in your field? What does the future of your field look like? And what advice do you have for people who might be pursuing a career like yours to prepare for that, to set themselves up for success in this type of area of work?
So the real answer is artificial intelligence. And that's not just and I'm the hesitation in my voice and the literal shaking of my head is not because I don't believe that and we're not preparing for it. I don't want it to seem like that's the big catchword that everyone's saying these days. And like, of course, everyone says it to be because it is like just in the zeitgeist, but it's true. Communication is going to change. How it's going to change, I don't know. I'm not claiming to be an expert in this, but it's going to change. And so I don't have any hard advice for folks who are thinking about getting into communication about exactly how they need to prepare for AI. What I will say though is I'm I'm somewhere in the middle of AI is not going to affect us at all, and AI is going to take over all our jobs. That's the latter is a possibility for some sectors, I don't think it's coming for SciComm, at least for the time being. People, it's humanizing, it's personal. People value people. People value hearing from people. And so even though we might use AI tools in creating, like I do it for outlines, for ideation, or things like that, it's by no mean plug and play. It's not copy paste. And I can't imagine a time, anytime soon, where it will be. So my suggestion would frankly be don't ignore it. Acknowledge that it exists, acknowledge that people are using it. Find out ways to use it in a way that is complementary, because I do think there are times and situations where it can be really useful and really give folks a leg up, but also we're still going to need communicators. We're still going to need folks who understand how to communicate. And so investing time and energy into crafting and perfecting and cultivating those skills is still going to be really appreciated.
Absolutely. I'm kind of on the fence about the whole AI thing as well. And especially I work at the university that I got my undergraduate at. And a lot of conversations been happening with faculty of, the law students are getting
Mm,
really into this whole AI thing, and the law department's trying to figure out how to handle that. And then the
mhm.
scientists, they're like, what are you going to do? How are you going to use this? You
Right,
know, AI is not going to do that integral for you. Um,
right.
but yeah, no, so I'm still kind of caught up in the whole, where's this going? How's it going to affect everything? Luckily, I'm not in law, so I don't have to worry about that part. But
Yeah,
um, yeah, I
yeah.
guess
It's
it's just
coming
something
though.
that
So
absolutely, yeah. And it's something that we can all, learn how to handle together.
yeah, exactly.
To wrap it up, though, I did have one final question.
Hmm.
And this can be about absolutely anything. It doesn't have to be in your field, it could be any topic, any kind of domain. I just want to know something that you're curious about today, in general, something you think about often.
Yeah, that's so I don't have like a Roman Empire answer to this. There's no there's nothing kind of like on the mind where I just wake up and it's like this is the thing. I do have I mentioned before my brain goes in a bunch of different directions and I like having a diversity of thoughts and interests, maybe to my detriment. I will say though, and this is kind of related, well not related, it's exactly related to what I do. But my thing I'm always wondering about is I'm still a conservationist at heart. And while I love the work I did at HEU and I really like the work I'm doing at ACS now, I'm not an earth and space scientist and I'm not a chemist, even though I do have a minor in chemistry, which you would have never have known until I got this job. But I'm am always often thinking about how can I how can we use these kind of like communication powers for good when it comes to conservation and how can I make that like individual impact? And I do, and this isn't like, I mean, curiosity might be the bad way of thinking about it, but this is something I think about often. I want to get to a point someday where I can, whether it's my job or just like a side hustle or whatever it is, I want to help communicate the value of our environment. And I want to do it on like a local level, frankly. There are great organizations who do it like big, giant scales. And I know some of the folks who do this work, that's amazing. I live in Arlington, Virginia. I'm right outside of DC. We have so much beautiful park space. And I'm involved in an organization that goes around and like buys up farmland to preserve it. And I just like I love that work so much, and I love the like, I love where I live, so I just, like I'm always wondering how do we make that better? How do we not just necessarily do the work better, but also get people to care about it? And so, that might be I'm not gonna say boring answer. It's very kind of on brand with what we're talking about, but it is true. It's something that I'm always like, I wanna figure out how to take this thing I did at work today and apply it to my personal life, but still have that divide because I like my work-life balance, frankly. And I think that's kind of going to be the perennial question for me. And someday, maybe that'll be the job. I hope someday it'll be at least an aspect of my life. But yeah, that's kind of that's something that's often on my mind.
Nice. It's cool to hear that tie back to conservation biology as we've sort of taken this journey through all of the different things that you've done in your career, seeing how almost like in a way where you started still impacts a lot of what you're curious about today. So yeah, we've had a lot of fun going on that journey with you. We really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and our audience about your career path and all of the insights and advice that you've given us. So thank you again. It's been great having you, and we are looking forward to seeing what you get up to in the future.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It's been great chatting with you.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.